When I do an assessment with somebody for the first time, I'm usually trying to get an idea of how long has this person been struggling in whatever state they've been struggling. In other words, I'm trying to establish a level of fatigue, whether it's mental fatigue, emotional fatigue, or physical fatigue. I know if a person has been struggling for a sustained period of time, that system is pressing much more to a kind of survival state than one that is conducive to longevity and optimal function and well-being and good health. So usually in that situation, I'm trying to check, is this person drinking enough water? Is this person getting enough sort of exercise? And again, when I say enough, I don't even mean, an hour workout a day. That might literally mean 5 or 10 minutes of something. I'm a firm believer in try and do the basics as well as you can. I would often say I'd prefer to do the basics brilliantly than to do some really, really fancy things sporadically. I think that continuity of good things produce ultimately the best outcomes down the line. So what one looks at there is if I've had a person who's not supplementing with anything, who genuinely is not getting out there to do any sort of activity, who's not sleeping well, I normally will select something from multiple facets and try and construct a very doable plan that they can implement immediately. And I always ask them, do you think you can do this? Inevitably, I've structured it in a way that, yes, absolutely. As opposed to sometimes, we're inclined to say, well, let's test everything under the sun. Let's establish all the micronutrients that may be necessary. Let's go ahead and make sure that all your macronutrients are correct. And let's go ahead, all the ratios are correct. And let's try and make sure that you're doing precisely the right exercise, precisely the right. That load is counterproductive for the vast majority of people that I see. So the idea is, again, can I enhance function sufficiently to give me some sort of progress? And then if mentally or emotionally I'm also making progress, those two things come together synergistically to actually accelerate the recovery. So what are the typical things I do? If it's talking about, again, hydration, I encourage people, first thing in the morning, just have a glass of water. Try and, regularly have something that keeps you hydrated. Try and do some sort of movement. I mean, I wrote a book 12, 13 years ago called No Sweat, which is no obstacles, spread workout, exercise accumulation training, which is basically a long way of saying any movement that you can do safely is beneficial to health and well-being. So I'll sit with the person oftentimes and say, let's just stand up and do a few stick-up exercises. I get the opportunity to do it. They get the opportunity to do it. Inevitably, they'll say, oh, it feels so good. Yeah, it took us 30 seconds. So trying to get people to do small things that are ultimately meaningful and disproportionately beneficial, I find that tremendously helpful to address this important subject of helping the physiology. So whether that be through the movement or through the diet, add an extra piece of fruit a day. If that's all you're doing along with your water, add some of that extra movement. Supplement-wise, inevitably, I look at a vitamin B complex. I find that, that is a tremendously helpful thing to do. Sometimes things like, simple amino acid like L-theanine. L-theanine, we know, has a tendency towards increasing of those neurotransmitters, the dopamine, the serotonin, the GABA, these kinds of things that are very helpful for brain function. Magnesium, oftentimes, I think is particularly helpful. I don't like isolated nutrient supplementation. I've just basically said that's exactly what I'm doing, right? I usually will look at some of those things, magnesium, B12s, vitamin D, but ultimately my encouragement is the cell is looking for a spectrum of nutrients. So to have something either from the diet, which usually takes time, energy, and effort, which is ideal, but not necessarily realistic, which is why I would default again at times to saying, let's find a good food-derived vitamin, mineral, phytonutrient supplement that is convenient enough to take with a glass of water in the morning and at least take half a step in a good direction. And when I'm taking half a step in a good direction with some of the supplements and some of the movement, and maybe one night a week where I'm getting enough sleep, and then a little bit of the, sort of lightened load in terms of mood, etc. What I find is that the results are actually significant and reasonably quick. In other words, 10, 14 days, I can sit with a person who has undergone a fairly dramatic change that has come from a fairly simple approach that factors in multiple facets. I know you know what that means, but I trust that makes sense.
I think interesting. The sleep is, obviously the subject. A lot of people are talking about, it, but we still underestimate how much sleep influence. And I think very often, just showing people what good sleep can do, remove that, if highlights the distinction. I am, I am that kind of person that can't do certain things. That like maybe that kind of person that can't do that when I'm tired.
What a great distinction to make. Absolutely. When we talk about these things, when I draw them typically, I'll say we can have a full potential and then we've got a functional potential.
Yeah.
Functional potential means how am I in my current state? If I have a good night's sleep and I go through a lot of the things that I just described right now, I'm potentially much, much better off than when I'm fatigued or when I'm down. That's what we call peaking for, sort of athletic performance. Is a recognition that I can do things to get me as close to my peak performance as possible. Well, the same is true if I don't allow myself to actually reach some levels of, recovery. I typically deplete things to the point of becoming fatigued, dysfunctional, burned out, and that weighs heavily, ironically, and typically interrupts sleep. So most of these things that you find compounding
Yes.
the particular direction that we're heading in. People who exercise self control in one area of life typically become people who exercise self control in other areas of life. And if self control is what typically allows us to act more consistently in line with better judgment, well, that follows that most people exercising reasonable self control in most areas of their life, in terms of the time they go to bed, the time they wake up, the exercise that they do, oh, so they benefit from those things. Yeah, it's one of those things where if I give my time and attention to the things that my body requires, my body rewards me by being much more cooperative with the things that I would like to do, and allows me to typically enjoy experiences substantially more. And it also allows me to deal with difficulties substantially better, which usually is collectively a very helpful place and a place to
So